In March 2011, a vibrant young woman vanished after a night out in Swindon. What began as a desperate search soon uncovered a chilling truth: a hidden predator living among ordinary people. This is not just a story of murder, but of secrets, justice, and lives forever changed. On the night of March 18, 2011, the streets of Swindon's Old Town were alive with the usual weekend buzz. Clubs and pubs spilled their patrons onto the pavements, laughter and music drifting into the early hours. Among the young people enjoying the night was 22-year-old Sion O'Callaghan, a woman whose friends and family knew her as warm, full of energy, and brimming with a zest for life. She had been out at Suju nightclub with her close friends, dancing and celebrating in the way that was typical for her. Smiling, carefree, and surrounded by those who adored her. At around 2:50 in the morning, she decided to leave the club. She told her friends she was heading home, confident in the short walk back to the flat she shared with her boyfriend, Kevin Reap. But that walk would never be completed. Within hours, the town would be thrust into a nightmare that gripped the community and spiraled into one of the most significant murder investigations Wiltshire police had ever undertaken. Sion's failure to return home immediately worried Kevin. He was not the kind of partner to overreact to lateness, but he knew Sion's habits, her routines, and the way she always checked in. Her absence gnawed at him. By morning, when her phone still went unanswered and none of her friends had heard from her, Kevin reported her missing. What began as a boyfriend's desperate concern quickly escalated into a major police operation. This wasn't a young woman who disappeared on whims. This was entirely out of character, and the silence around her only confirmed the sense of dread. The police response was swift. They knew that in cases of missing women, the first hours were crucial. Investigators began combing through CCTV footage from the area, focusing on the streets around Suju nightclub and the roads leading towards Sion's flat. Detectives also began to trace the last pings from her mobile phone, using technology to narrow down her movements after she left her friends. What they discovered both shocked and terrified them. The last signals from her phone had not come from Swindon at all, but from Savernake Forest, a dense, isolated woodland about 15 miles away. For Sion to have ended up there in the middle of the night made no sense, unless someone had taken her. The possibility of abduction began to solidify into certainty. Wiltshire police launched one of the largest search operations in its history, with volunteers, specialist officers, and even helicopters scanning both urban streets and rural landscapes. The community came together, holding vigils, distributing posters, and keeping hope alive that Sion might be found alive. But beneath that hope was a gnawing fear, one that grew darker with each passing hour. Among the theories that investigators pursued, one became increasingly likely. Sion had left the nightclub and encountered a taxi. In Swindon, taxis were a common sight outside late-night venues, picking up people who were unable or unwilling to walk home. Detectives began scrutinizing local taxi companies, questioning drivers, and searching for any connection between their routes and the trail of evidence leading towards Savernake Forest. One name began to stand out to them: a driver with a record that raised questions, a man whose movements in the early hours of that morning aligned with their suspicions. His name was Christopher Hallowell. At first glance, Hallowell seemed ordinary. A 47-year-old father of three, he worked as a cab driver, providing rides across Swindon to support his family. To neighbors and acquaintances, he was quiet, even unremarkable, the kind of man who blended into the background of daily life. But as detectives pulled on the threads of his life, a different picture began to emerge. Hallowell had a history of instability, a fascination with violence, and an unsettling interest in women that went beyond the normal boundaries of attraction. He was not the sort of man who stood out in a crowd, but this very ability to appear normal had allowed his darker urges to remain hidden. As the days passed, pressure mounted on the investigative team. Sion's family made heartfelt appeals to the public, begging for information. Her mother, Elaine, appeared on camera, her grief etched in every word, urging anyone who had seen or heard anything to come forward. Kevin, shattered but determined, worked closely with police, clinging to hope but haunted by fear. The media attention grew, with newspapers and television stations covering the case daily, amplifying both the urgency and the tension. The entire country watched, waiting for answers. When police finally moved to arrest Hallowell, they did so with caution, aware that any mistake could jeopardize both Sion's case and the fragile possibility of finding her alive. On March 24th, nearly a week after Sion vanished, Hallowell was taken into custody. What followed during his interrogation was both extraordinary and deeply unsettling. Detective Superintendent Steve Fulcher, leading the investigation, pressed Hallowell for information, desperate to locate Sion's body. Fulcher made a controversial decision. Instead of waiting for formal procedures that could take time, he spoke directly with Hallowell in a way that skirted legal convention. In that conversation, Hallowell offered something chilling. He would lead police to where Sion's body lay, but he also hinted at another secret, another victim. The revelation was devastating. It meant that the man who had taken Sion's life was not acting for the first time. He had done this before. He was not an ordinary taxi driver caught in a single moment of madness, but a predator with a history of violence stretching back years. The magnitude of this discovery was difficult to comprehend, even for seasoned detectives. When Hallowell led officers to the rural area near Uffington, their worst fears were confirmed. Hidden in the brush near the famous White Horse Hill, Sion's body was found. The grief that swept through her family, her friends, and her community was immeasurable. The search for hope was over, replaced by the grim reality of loss. The town of Swindon, which had prayed for her safe return, now faced the devastating truth that she had been brutally murdered by a man who had driven its streets for years without suspicion. As her loved ones mourned, the investigation widened. Hallowell's chilling admission of another victim turned the case from a tragedy into something far larger, a glimpse into the mind of a serial predator who had lived in plain sight. For the first time, detectives realized they were not only seeking justice for Sion O'Callaghan, but uncovering the hidden crimes of a man who might have killed before and who had almost certainly planned to kill again. The discovery of Sion O'Callaghan's body brought both relief and devastation. Relief, because her family finally had the answer they dreaded but needed. Devastation, because the hope of finding her alive was gone forever. For Detective Superintendent Steve Fulcher and his team, the moment was heavy with emotion, but there was little time to dwell. In the tense conversations with Christopher Hallowell, it became clear that this was not an isolated crime. Hallowell had more to reveal, and the way he revealed it would set off a chain of controversy that still lingers in discussions about British policing. Fulcher understood that Hallowell held the keys to another case, another woman who had disappeared years before. In a risky decision made under immense pressure, he broke away from traditional procedure. Instead of allowing Hallowell the comfort of silence or letting him manipulate the system, Fulcher pressed on, asking questions, pushing for truth. Out in the open air, away from the confines of an interrogation room, Hallowell let his mask slip. He told Fulcher he could take him to another grave, the resting place of a woman no one had been looking for in years. It was a shocking confession, delivered not with emotion but with a disturbing calm, as though revealing a casual secret rather than admitting to the destruction of another life. The woman he spoke of was Becky Godden-Edwards, a 20-year-old sex worker who had disappeared in 2003. For years, her mother, Karen, had lived in torment, never knowing what had happened to her daughter. Becky had struggled with addiction and had lived a vulnerable life on the fringes of society, but to her family she was still cherished, still deeply loved. Her disappearance had barely made the news at the time, her case swallowed by the countless unresolved files of missing persons. But in that moment with Fulcher, Hallowell gave Becky a voice again. He admitted to killing her, burying her in a remote field in Gloucestershire. Suddenly, the investigation was no longer just about Sion. It was about uncovering the scale of Hallowell's crimes. As officers followed his directions, the weight of what they were dealing with became clearer. Hallowell was not a man who had lost control one night in a fit of rage. He was methodical, calculating, and far more dangerous than anyone had realized. The burial site of Becky Godden-Edwards was located, her remains finally recovered after nearly a decade. For her mother, The news was both crushing and strangely healing. An end to years of agonizing uncertainty, but also confirmation of the darkest fears she had carried for so long. While investigators pieced together the evidence linking Hallowell to both women, questions about his past began to surface. He was not the caricature of a violent monster. He was an ordinary man, a father, someone who drove people home at night and blended into the fabric of daily life. Yet beneath this ordinary exterior was an obsession with murder. Diaries and items recovered from his home suggested a man who had long fantasized about killing, who had stalked women, and who treated murder not as a sudden impulse but as a compulsion carefully fed over years. Detectives were haunted by the possibility that Becky and Sion might not be his only victims. The legal case against him, however, faced challenges. Because of the way Fulcher had secured his confession about Becky's murder, outside the strict bounds of police procedure, much of that testimony risked being inadmissible in court. It was a bitter pill for the investigation team, who had prioritized finding the victims and their resting places over adhering to rigid legal processes. To them, saving lives and providing closure outweighed the technicalities, but the justice system saw it differently. This tension set off one of the most contentious debates in modern policing. Should the pursuit of truth ever come at the cost of procedure? Meanwhile, the community of Swindon remained stunned. Sion's friends and family were plunged into mourning, but they also faced the media spotlight, their pain broadcast across the nation. Her mother, Elaine, spoke with dignity and courage, describing her daughter as vibrant, loving, and deeply missed. Kevin, her boyfriend, endured the torment of being the one who had raised the alarm, only to see the search end in tragedy. For Becky's mother, the reopening of her daughter's case thrust her back into grief, but also into a strange kind of relief. She finally knew what had happened after years of silence. Hallowell himself seemed to thrive on the attention. In custody, he gave the impression of a man who enjoyed holding power, dangling details about his crimes, and relishing the discomfort of those seeking justice. He was intelligent enough to know the value of what he held back, the secrets that might keep investigators on edge. He taunted them with hints of other killings, other women, without ever offering full clarity. Detectives feared they were dealing with a serial killer whose full tally of victims might never be known. In 2012, Hallowell was tried for the murder of Sion O'Callaghan. The evidence against him was overwhelming. CCTV, phone records, and forensic analysis painted a damning picture. He was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 25 years. For Sion's family, it was justice of a kind, but for Becky's family, the road was longer and more painful. Because of the controversies surrounding Fulcher's handling of the confession, charges for Becky's murder were delayed. It would take years of legal battles before Hallowell was finally brought to account for that crime. Detective Superintendent Fulcher paid a heavy price for his decisions. Though his actions had led directly to the recovery of both victims and had prevented further suffering for the families, he was criticized for breaching procedure. His career suffered, and he eventually resigned from the force, convinced that doing what was morally right had cost him professionally. Yet for many in the public, Fulcher became something of a tragic hero, a man who had prioritized humanity over bureaucracy. By the time Hallowell's second trial came years later, the picture of him as a cold and calculating killer was firmly established. His double life had been exposed. To the outside world, he had been a taxi driver, a father, a man living an unremarkable existence. But in reality, he had harbored a secret world of violence, control, and manipulation. The murders of Sion and Becky were not isolated acts but the expression of a predator who had lived undetected for far too long. The story was no longer simply about two young women whose lives were stolen. It became a cautionary tale about the hidden dangers that exist within ordinary communities, the predators who blend seamlessly into everyday life, and the fragile line between safety and violence. For Swindon, the memory of March 2011 would never fade. It was a reminder of how quickly normal life could shatter, how darkness could lurk in the most unsuspecting of places, and how the pursuit of justice sometimes comes at immense personal cost. The final chapter of the story of Sion O'Callaghan and Becky Godden-Edwards unfolded not in the chaos of a frantic search or the horror of sudden discovery, but in the slow, painful grind of the justice system. After Hallowell's conviction for Sion's murder in 2012, the shadow of Becky's case still loomed. Her remains had been found, her mother finally had the truth she had begged for. Yet the man responsible had not been held accountable in a court of law. The legal battle dragged on for years, caught in the tangle of questions surrounding the way Detective Superintendent Steve Fulcher had obtained Hallowell's confession. The police officer who had made the choice to prioritize the recovery of victims over strict adherence to procedure became a controversial figure, praised by some as a man of integrity and condemned by others as reckless. The debate was fierce, but for Becky's family, it was simply unbearable waiting. They wanted justice, not arguments about rules. The slow pace of the case tested the resilience of Karen Edwards, Becky's mother. She had lived for years in the torment of uncertainty, wondering what had happened to her daughter. And when the truth finally came, she was thrown into another torment, watching the system falter in its duty. Each court date, each delay, each headline reawakened the anguish. But she did not stop speaking. Karen gave interviews, fought to keep Becky's name in the public eye, and reminded everyone that this was not about legal loopholes, but about a daughter stolen and a family shattered. Her determination gave strength to others, though the weight she carried was immense. For Sion's family, the conviction had brought some closure, but their pain was no less enduring. Elaine Pickford, Sion's mother, spoke openly about her loss, reminding the world of who her daughter had been beyond the headlines. A vibrant young woman, full of love, with a future cruelly cut short, Kevin, her boyfriend, lived with the enduring ache of losing not just a partner, but the life they had planned together. The images of Sion's smiling face, which had once been splashed across missing posters in a desperate bid for help, now remained as a permanent reminder of what had been taken. Their grief was private, but it became entwined with the public story of Hallowell, a man who had changed their lives forever. As years passed, the investigation into Hallowell's life deepened. Detectives and journalists alike questioned whether the two known victims were the only ones. His methods, his secretive nature, and the way he hinted at more deaths all raised suspicions. He had worked as a taxi driver, a role that gave him access to countless vulnerable women late at night. He had a fascination with burial sites, with remote rural areas where bodies could be hidden from view. Some investigators were convinced he had killed more than twice, though proof remained elusive. For the families of other missing women in the region, the name Hallowell became a haunting possibility, a question mark they could never shake. In 2016, after years of waiting, Hallowell was finally tried for Becky Godin-Edwards' murder. The courtroom became a stage where the full horror of his actions was laid bare once more. Prosecutors painted him not as a man who had snapped, but as a predator who had carefully chosen, abducted, and killed vulnerable women. They described Becky's life, not to define her by her struggles but to give her humanity back, to remind the court that she had been a daughter, a sister, a young woman with dreams, even if life had been difficult. Hallowell showed little emotion throughout, his cold demeanor reinforcing the picture of him as a man without remorse. The jury convicted him, and this time there would be no minimum sentence, no possibility of release. Hallowell was handed a whole life order, ensuring that he would die behind bars. For Karen, it was justice, though it could never bring Becky back. For Elaine, it was another confirmation that the man who had murdered her daughter would never walk free again. For Steve Fulcher, who had by then left the force, it was vindication of sorts, the knowledge that his controversial decision had ultimately led to this moment. But for him, the cost had been personal. His career had ended, and he carried the burden of criticism alongside the knowledge that he had acted out of humanity. The legacy of the case lingered long after the verdicts. Documentaries, books, and public debates dissected every angle. The bravery of the families, the tragedy of 2 stolen lives, the actions of the police, and the character of Hallowell himself. To some, the story was about systemic failure. To others, it was about the resilience of ordinary people in the face of extraordinary pain. For many, it was a reminder of the hidden dangers that can lurk in seemingly ordinary places, embodied by a taxi driver who lived in plain sight while harboring violent fantasies. In Swindon, the memory of March 2011 became woven into the town's identity. the nightclub where Sion had spent her last night out, the streets she had walked, and the countryside where she was found all took on new meaning for those who remembered. For young women, her story was a warning about vulnerability, though it was never her fault that she crossed paths with a predator. For the police, it was a case that reshaped conversations about procedure and morality. For her family, it was simply the unending ache of loss. The lives of Sion and Becky were different, their circumstances worlds apart, but they were bound together in death by the cruelty of the same man. Their families were connected through grief, strangers drawn into the same orbit of sorrow and remembrance. Together, they became symbols of resilience, ensuring their daughters were remembered not just as victims but as people. Their stories continue to echo in documentaries, news features, and public conversations, serving as both memorial and cautionary tale. Christopher Hallowell remains in prison, locked away from the world he once moved through unnoticed. His name has become synonymous with predation, his legacy one of destruction. But beyond him, the story of this case belongs to the women whose lives he stole and to the families who refused to let them be forgotten. The final verdict may have closed the legal chapter, but the emotional chapter endures, written in the memories of those who loved Sion and Becky and in the lasting impact their stories left behind. The case of Sion O'Callaghan's murder began as a missing person report in a quiet English town and ended as a national reckoning with hidden evil. It showed how quickly the ordinary can become extraordinary in the worst of ways, how grief can unite communities, and how justice, even when it comes late, still matters. Above all, it left a reminder that behind every headline, behind every crime statistic, are lives full of light extinguished too soon, and families left to carry that light forward in memory. In the heart of Birmingham, a hard-working father of 5 set out for another night shift, unaware it would be his last journey. What began as a routine taxi fare spiraled into a chilling act of violence that shocked a city and left a family shattered forever. In the quiet hours before dawn on November 29, 2022, the streets of Birmingham carried the familiar hum of late-night traffic, neon lights glowing over the city as pubs emptied and nightclubs closed their doors. For many, it was the end of another night out. But for Mohammed Istakar, a 44-year-old taxi driver and father of 5, it was simply part of his working life. Driving the night shift was routine for him. He had built his life around the hard, relentless hours behind the wheel, ferrying strangers across the city while his family slept at home. He did it not just as a job, but as a duty to provide for his wife, his children, and his elderly mother. Mohammed was known for his kindness, for the way he would chat with passengers, offering a calm presence in the often chaotic nightlife of the city. He was a man with responsibilities, but also with warmth, always ready to greet his neighbors with a smile and lend a helping hand. Yet, like every taxi driver, he knew the risks of late-night fares, the possibility of drunken passengers, violent outbursts, or situations that spiraled out of control. Still, he carried on because it was his livelihood. He had no idea that this particular fare would be his last. The 2 passengers he picked up that night were teenagers Oliver Pugh, then 19 years old, and Luca DeFazio, 18. They blended into the nightlife crowd, appearing just like countless others Mohammed had driven before. CCTV footage captured the 2 young men climbing into his cab in Birmingham city center. To an outsider, it looked like nothing out of the ordinary. 2 friends heading home after a night out. But what unfolded after that ride would turn into a story of senseless violence that shocked a community and destroyed a family. The taxi journey initially followed its usual rhythm. The city lights faded into quieter streets as Mohammed drove toward the Solihull area, following the directions of his passengers. They asked him to turn onto Bragg's Farm Lane, a narrow country road isolated from the main routes. It was a detour that made little sense so late at night, but drivers like Mohammed often accepted such requests without question, focused on their duty to get passengers where they asked to go. That trust would be betrayed in the most brutal way. As the vehicle came to a stop, Oliver Pugh pulled out a knife. In an instant, what had been an ordinary taxi ride transformed into a scene of unimaginable horror. Pugh launched his attack with frightening aggression, striking out at the man who had moments earlier been doing no more than his job. Witnesses would later recount that Muhammad tried desperately to reason with his attacker. He begged for his life, telling them that he had a family, that he had children who depended on him. His words were not enough. The knife continued its savage work, forcing him to escape his own vehicle and run into the darkness of the country lane. But escape was impossible. Pugh chased him down, delivering the final, fatal blows. In the stillness of Bragg's farm lane, a hard-working father's life came to a brutal end. Muhammad collapsed on the roadside, far from home, alone in the night. He would never return to his wife, never again embrace his children, never again laugh with his family. The aftermath was as callous as the attack itself. Pugh and DeFazio dragged Muhammad's lifeless body from the scene, climbed back into his taxi, and drove off. In a shocking display of disregard for the man they had just murdered, they stripped the vehicle of its number plates and taxi markings, trying to disguise it before embarking on a reckless joyride. They crashed into a fence and eventually abandoned the car altogether, leaving it as a trail of evidence. Their actions revealed not only their guilt but also their youth, impulsive, foolish, and yet devastatingly violent. In the hours that followed, the city carried on unaware of the tragedy that had just taken place. It wasn't until 2 members of the public discovered Muhammad's body lying cold by the roadside that the reality of what had happened began to emerge. Emergency services rushed to the scene, but it was already too late. He had died where he fell, his final moments spent pleading for his life. As dawn broke, news began to spread through Birmingham's taxi driver community. A colleague had not made it home. A family had been torn apart in a single night. For the police, the discovery of Muhammad's body marked the beginning of a race to find the people responsible. What they did not yet know was that CCTV footage and witness accounts would soon lead them directly to the 2 young men whose reckless actions had ended a man's life and shattered a community's sense of safety. But while detectives worked to piece together the events of that night, Muhammad's family awoke to a nightmare they could never have imagined. His wife, Nasira Mogul, had prepared a meal for him before his shift, unaware it would be the last meal he would ever eat. His eldest daughter, Mariam, a 26-year-old audiologist, would later speak about how her father had been their hero, the one who carried the weight of the family on his shoulders. His 5 children, ranging from young to grown, were suddenly without the man they looked up to most. His mother, siblings, and extended family were left with the unbearable grief of a loved one taken so violently. In those early hours before arrests were made, before trials and sentencing, the reality of the crime was stark. A hard-working father had been brutally murdered by 2 teenagers he had trusted enough to let into his taxi. It was a senseless act of violence, leaving behind a trail of grief, anger, and questions about how such a tragedy could happen on an ordinary night in Birmingham. The discovery of Muhammad Istakar's body in the early morning hours of November 29th set in motion a complex and urgent police investigation. 2 members of the public who stumbled upon his lifeless body in the stillness of Bragg's farm lane had immediately raised the alarm, and the arrival of emergency services confirmed the tragic reality. Muhammad had been stabbed multiple times, left in the dark countryside lane where he had collapsed and died. For the officers who responded first, it was clear this was no accident, no random collapse or medical episode. It was a brutal, deliberate killing. West Midlands police quickly sealed off the area, treating it as a major crime scene. Forensic teams combed every inch of the lane, marking blood spatters, tire tracks, and footprints. They worked methodically, gathering samples and preserving evidence that would later become crucial in identifying the killers. In those early hours, all they knew was that a father of 5 had been murdered while working the night shift as a taxi driver, and that his killers were still at large. Detectives immediately began piecing together the last known movements of the victim. They traced his taxi's journey through Birmingham city center using a network of CCTV cameras that covered nightlife hotspots. The footage revealed Muhammad stopping in the early hours to collect 2 young men, both dressed casually, blending into the busy night crowd. This grainy footage would become the cornerstone of the investigation, capturing the moment that his final passengers entered his car. At the same time, officers launched urgent appeals to the public for information. Taxi driver associations across Birmingham were contacted, warned about the killing, and urged to come forward with anything they might have seen. Colleagues of Muhammad, shocked and shaken by the news, spoke to police about his regular routes, his working habits, and the places he would most often be found. These details helped investigators narrow down where to search for his missing taxi, which was later discovered abandoned after being crashed into a fence. The vehicle bore the marks of tampering. Its number plates removed, its taxi livery stripped off. The killers had made a crude attempt to disguise it, but in doing so had left behind fingerprints, traces of blood, and DNA. The public appeal was answered more quickly than expected. Within a day, one of the passengers, 18-year-old Luca DeFazio, walked into a police station and gave himself up. His decision was not one of remorse for the killing itself, but rather an acknowledgement that the net was closing in fast. He was immediately arrested on suspicion of murder. Investigators interrogated him intensely, aware that the identity of the second suspect, the one wielding the knife, was crucial. Though evasive at times, DeFazio's presence in custody was a breakthrough. It gave police a clearer picture of the duo's movements that night and began to outline the dynamics between the two young men. Meanwhile, the search for the second suspect became the priority. That suspect, 19-year-old Oliver Pugh, had vanished. While DeFazio had faced the consequences head-on, Pugh had chosen to run. Police launched a manhunt using intelligence to track his movements. Friends, acquaintances, and family members were questioned. Social media was monitored, and CCTV networks expanded the last known sightings. The urgency of finding him was not just about securing justice for Muhammad, but also ensuring that a dangerous young man armed with a knife was taken off the streets before he struck again. The breakthrough came when officers traced him to a caravan in Derbyshire. Hiding in a makeshift shelter, Pugh seemed determined to evade capture, but armed police closed in and arrested him without further incident. With both suspects now in custody, the full story of the night began to emerge. Under questioning, Pugh denied murder, but forensic evidence told another story. Bloodstains matched to Muhammad were found, along with CCTV footage that placed Pugh and DeFazio together with the victim just before the killing. The stolen taxi, with its stripped plates and damaged bodywork, carried further incriminating evidence. Detective Inspector Michelle Thurgood, who led the investigation, described the attack as senseless and deeply disturbing. Her team had to reconstruct not only the timeline of events, but also the motivation of two teenagers who had turned a routine taxi ride into a deadly ambush. The prosecution would later argue that Pugh had carried the knife with the intention to use it, while DeFazio had played a supporting role, fully aware of the presence of the weapon. As detectives built their case, the grief of Muhammad's family was unfolding in parallel. His wife, Nasira, struggled to explain to their children why their father had not returned home from his shift. His eldest daughter, Mariam, who had spoken to him only hours before his death, became a key voice in the family's grief, describing him as their anchor, the one who kept the family together. For his elderly mother, the shock was overwhelming, losing a son in such brutal and public circumstances. While the investigation was clinical, methodical, and fact-based, the human side of the tragedy was raw and unrelenting. The trial preparation gathered pace over the months that followed. Prosecutors prepared to show that Pugh had acted with intent to kill, and that his decision to bring a knife and use it on a working man who posed no threat demonstrated a chilling disregard for life. The defense, on the other hand, attempted to paint the picture of impulsive actions, poor decisions, and a night that spiraled out of control. But the evidence, the CCTV, the forensic matches, the witness testimony, began to close in like a net around the accused. By the time the case reached Birmingham Crown Court, the community was watching closely. Taxi drivers across the region, many of whom had known Muhammad personally, turned up to show support for his family. They wanted to see justice delivered not only for him but for every driver who put themselves at risk working late into the night. The trial promised to reveal the cold, hard truth of what had happened on Bragg's Farm Lane and why a hard-working father never made it home that night. The stage was set for a courtroom drama that would expose the darkest side of youth violence and knife crime in Britain. Families on both sides prepared for a reckoning, one grieving the loss of a husband and father, the other about to face the reality that their sons' futures would be defined by the brutality of a single night. The investigation had been swift, but the emotional toll was only just beginning to surface as the legal system prepared to weigh the evidence and deliver its verdict. When the trial of Oliver Pugh and Luca DeFazio finally opened at Birmingham Crown Court in the summer of 2023, the weight of grief and expectation filled the air. Families, reporters, and members of the taxi community sat quietly as the prosecution laid out its case, describing in painstaking detail how an ordinary fare had ended in extraordinary violence. The jury listened as Mohammed Istakhar's final moments were reconstructed through witness statements, forensic reports, and CCTV footage. What emerged was a harrowing narrative of a man begging for his life, pleading with two young men who showed him no mercy. The prosecution argued that Oliver Pugh had left his home that night carrying a knife, fully prepared to use it. His decision to lure the taxi into a secluded country lane was portrayed not as coincidence but as premeditation, a deliberate choice to isolate the victim before launching his attack. They described how Mohammed's desperate words, "I have a family, I have children," were ignored, drowned out by the frenzy of violence. The forensic evidence reinforced this narrative. Multiple stab wounds, a trail of blood leading from the taxi to where Mohammed had collapsed, and the abandoned car with its stripped number plates and livery, a crude attempt at covering their tracks. The jury was also shown footage of Pugh and DeFazio climbing into Mohammed's cab in Birmingham city center. The grainy images seemed ordinary at first glance, yet they carried enormous weight, the moment the victim unknowingly welcomed danger into his car. Further CCTV clips and witness accounts traced the car's route out of the city and toward Solihull, building an unbroken chain of evidence that left little room for doubt. DeFazio's role in the case proved more complex. The prosecution acknowledged that while he had been present throughout, he had not delivered the fatal blows. His defense argued that he was a bystander, caught in the escalating violence of his friend. His decision to later hand himself in was presented as evidence of conscience, though the prosecution reminded the jury that he too had carried a knife that night. The image of two teenagers, both armed and both complicit in a violent robbery-turned-murder, was difficult to shake. Throughout the trial, Mohammed's family sat quietly in the gallery, listening to the grisly details of how their loved one was taken from them. His eldest daughter, Mariam, wiped away tears as prosecutors described the final chase down Bragg's farm lane. His wife, Nasira, sat alongside relatives, her face etched with the pain of a widow who had lost her partner without warning. Each piece of evidence, each retelling of the night, forced them to relive the horror again and again. When Oliver Pugh took the stand, he denied murder. He claimed events had spiraled out of control, that he had not intended to kill. But his words were at odds with the evidence, with the knife he had carried, with the deliberate targeting of a vulnerable man alone in his taxi. The jury weighed his testimony against the overwhelming forensic and digital evidence, and the balance fell heavily against him. After weeks of testimony, arguments, and cross-examinations, the jury returned with their verdicts. Oliver Pugh was found guilty of murder and possession of a bladed article. The words carried finality, echoing through the courtroom as his family sat in stunned silence. For Mohammed's relatives, it was a moment of justice, though not relief. No sentence could bring him back. For Pugh, it was the end of his youth and the beginning of a life defined by a single violent night. Luca DeFazio was cleared of murder but found guilty of possessing a knife. The judge acknowledged his presence at the scene but distinguished between the active killer and the passive accomplice. He was sentenced to a month in custody, time he had already served while awaiting trial, and released. His freedom contrasted sharply with the heavy punishment handed down to Pugh, but it did little to ease the anger felt by those who saw both men as complicit in Mohammed's death. When the time came for sentencing, the courtroom grew still. The judge addressed Oliver Pugh directly, condemning his callousness and the sheer senselessness of the crime. He noted that Mohammed had been a hard-working father, targeted while doing nothing more than his job. Pugh was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 27 years before being eligible for parole. It was a punishment that would keep him behind bars through the prime of his life, a stark reminder of the cost of his actions. For Muhammad's family, the verdicts and sentences were only the beginning of a lifelong struggle. His wife faced the reality of raising 5 children alone. His eldest daughter stepped forward as the family spokesperson, speaking to the media outside the court about their father's legacy. She described him as their hero, a man who worked tirelessly to provide for his loved ones, and she called for stronger protections for taxi drivers who faced daily risks on the job. She demanded changes in policy, safety features in taxis, better protection for late-night workers, and more comprehensive education in schools to combat knife crime. Her voice, strong but filled with grief, carried her father's memory into the public consciousness. The community response was equally powerful. Vigils were held in Birmingham and Solihull, where friends, neighbors, and fellow drivers gathered to honor Muhammad's life. They lit candles, shared memories, and comforted one another in the face of senseless tragedy. For many taxi drivers, the murder was a chilling reminder of their own vulnerability, a reflection of the risks they took every time they picked up strangers in the middle of the night. The story of Muhammad Istakhar's murder became more than a criminal case. It became a symbol of the toll knife crime takes on ordinary families. His death was not only the loss of a father, a husband, a son, but also a warning of what happens when violence becomes normalized among youth. Oliver Pugh and Luca DeFazio were young men with their whole lives ahead of them. Yet one night of reckless violence ended one life and destroyed many others. In the years to come, Muhammad's family would continue to carry his memory, striving to ensure his death was not in vain. For them, justice was not just the conviction of his killer, but the hope that no other family would have to endure the same pain. His story remains a haunting reminder of the fragility of life, the cruelty of violence, and the enduring strength of a family determined to honor their hero. In Amsterdam, on a cold November night in East London, a chilling prophecy came true inside a taxi. A young man whispered, "They will kill me," moments before masked attackers struck. This is not just a story of murder. It's a haunting tale of fear, betrayal, and justice finally served. On the night of November 11th, 2023, the streets of Newham carried the usual hum of weekend life. Cars rolling through dimly lit junctions, late-night shops still glowing, and pedestrians hurrying home against the cold air. But as the clock ticked past 10 o'clock, one of those streets became the stage for a violent and calculated ambush that would end a young man's life and set off a chain of police operations, court battles, and grief that echoed across East London. Inside a hired taxi, 26-year-old Anselm Senage sat with an unease that was impossible to ignore. He was not a stranger to the darker undercurrents of the city, and perhaps he knew better than most that danger rarely arrived without warning. As the cab turned onto Victoria Avenue, his eyes kept darting to the rear window. Behind them, a car shadowed their movements, keeping steady, uncomfortably close. His fear broke into words. Turning to the driver, he uttered a line that now lingers as both haunting and prophetic. "There is one car behind. They will kill me." The driver, startled by the sudden admission, had little time to process what his passenger meant. Moments later, headlights from a stolen silver Mitsubishi surged forward, cutting across the taxi's path and forcing the driver to a halt at the junction of Victoria Avenue and Grangewood Street. The street, though residential, had quieted at that hour, leaving no immediate witnesses to the violence that was about to erupt. The doors of the Mitsubishi burst open, and men in dark clothing and masks poured out, their hands gripping weapons that glinted under the street lamps. Long knives and machetes designed for intimidation and death. The attack was swift. The masked figures encircled the taxi, slamming at the glass and doors, determined to get to the man inside. The driver froze, caught in a moment of disbelief and terror, while Anselm sat pressed against the seat, his fear now fully realized. One assailant struck first, lunging toward the window and thrusting a blade into his chest. The act was deliberate, targeted, and delivered with chilling precision. The entire assault lasted seconds, but its impact was irreversible. As the attackers scrambled back into the Mitsubishi, the taxi driver's desperate attempts to revive his passenger were in vain. Blood soaked through Anselm's clothes as he struggled for breath, but the wound had been catastrophic. Emergency services were called immediately, but by the time paramedics arrived, Anselm Senage was already gone. The once ordinary street was now cordoned off, filled with flashing lights, uniformed officers, and the kind of silence that hangs heavy after sudden violence. The initial hours after the killing were defined by chaos and confusion. Who were the attackers? Why had they targeted this young man so openly, in full view of the public? And what did the final words of the victim truly mean? Detectives at the scene quickly realized this was no random act of violence. The precision, the number of assailants, the stolen car, it all pointed toward an organized and premeditated attack. As forensic teams combed the area, securing fragments of evidence, the story of Anselm Senage began to surface. At just 26, he had lived a life marked by ambition but shadowed by risky choices. His name was familiar to those who knew of the quiet networks of drug dealing that operated through East London. In the aftermath of the murder, investigators discovered drugs and incriminating messages on his phone, suggesting his involvement in small-scale supply. To the outside world, he may have appeared like many other young men navigating the city's opportunities and struggles, but to those immersed in that underworld, he was a figure tied to rivalries and debts, things that often escalated beyond words into bloodshed. Yet, whatever his past, what mattered in that moment was the brutality of his death. A life had been taken in a calculated public strike, and detectives made it their mission to identify the men who carried out the crime. CCTV footage quickly became one of the investigation's most powerful tools. Cameras picked up the stolen Mitsubishi entering the area, circling the streets, and eventually intercepting the taxi. Hours of footage were analyzed, tracking the movements of the suspects both before and after the murder. The taxi driver's testimony added chilling clarity. He described the moment the Mitsubishi appeared, the masked figures jumping out, and the fear in his passenger's voice. For investigators, this was a critical piece of evidence, reinforcing the idea that the attack had been planned in advance and that Anselm had been followed deliberately. Within days, names began to emerge. Detectives identified 4 suspects linked to the Mitsubishi and the ambush. Mohammed Saqib Khan, age 24, Mohammed Samuel Mia, 19, Zain Ali, 22, and Ibrahim Naim, 18. Each had played a role that night. Khan was suspected of delivering the fatal stab wound. Mia had acted alongside him in the attack. Ali was believed to have assisted in the assault and even stolen the victim's phone during the chaos. Naim had been the driver of the getaway car, ensuring the group could escape the scene before police arrived. What followed was a relentless manhunt. In East London, officers carried out raids at addresses linked to the suspects, gathering clothing, mobile devices, and forensic evidence. Traces of DNA connected Mia and Khan to items found in the Mitsubishi. Mobile phone records placed the suspects in the area at the time of the murder, corroborating the timeline pieced together by detectives. The evidence was tightening around the group, but one obstacle soon became apparent. While Mia, Ali, and Naim were tracked down and arrested within weeks of the murder, Khan had fled. His disappearance complicated the investigation, raising fears that he might escape justice altogether. For weeks, his name remained on wanted lists across the country, until intelligence suggested he had left the UK and was hiding. This revelation shifted the case into international territory. Detectives worked with authorities in the Netherlands, sharing information and coordinating surveillance. On December 4th, less than a month after the murder, Khan was located and arrested in Amsterdam. His capture was a turning point. Extradition proceedings followed swiftly, and by January 12, 2024, Khan was flown back to the UK to face charges of murder and possession of a knife. For the family of Anselm Senage, the arrests brought a grim relief. Their loved one's killers had been identified and captured, But nothing could erase the image of what had been done to him, nor the reality that his life had been cut short so violently. His cousin, Elira, later described the pain as unbearable, a wound that would never heal, compounded by the knowledge that his attackers had acted with such cold deliberation. As the months moved forward and the suspects prepared to stand trial, the story of that night in Newham became not just about one man's death, but about the wider currents of violence gripping London. Knife crime had already scarred countless families, and the murder of Anselm Senage added yet another name to the growing list of young lives lost. The city had witnessed another moment where fear, rivalry, and retribution spilled onto its streets, leaving behind devastation that could not be undone. The stage was set for one of the most closely followed trials of 2024, where the details of the killing would be laid bare, and the actions of 4 young men would be scrutinized in the cold light of the courtroom. For now, though, what remained was the memory of that November night, the fear in a young man's voice, the flash of weapons under street lamps, and the silence that followed after the killers vanished into the darkness. As the investigation gathered momentum, the early breakthroughs gave detectives confidence, but the work was painstaking. Every frame of CCTV footage had to be examined, every item recovered from the suspects' homes tested, and every lead pursued. The murder of Anselm Senage had shocked the local community, not only because of the brazen way it was carried out, but also because it demonstrated a level of planning and ruthlessness that made it clear this was no ordinary street altercation. Detectives understood that the evidence needed to be presented with absolute precision if the prosecution was to secure convictions in court. The arrests of 3 of the suspects came quickly. Within weeks of the killing, officers swooped on addresses in East London linked to Mohammed Samuel Mia, Zain Ali, and Ibrahim Naim. In each case, they were taken by surprise, confronted with heavily armed officers who left no chance for escape. Forensic teams immediately began examining clothing seized from their homes, matching fibers and traces of blood to the crime. DNA testing revealed strong links between the suspects and the stolen Mitsubishi, providing a forensic chain that tied them directly to the scene. Their mobile phone data revealed even more. Location tracking placed them near Victoria Avenue at the exact time of the ambush, while incriminating messages hinted at their coordination in the days before the attack. But the absence of the 4th man, Mohammed Saqib Khan, cast a shadow over the progress. Khan, believed to be the one who delivered the fatal stab, had slipped out of the country. For a while, there were whispers that he had fled north, or perhaps gone into hiding with relatives. Then intelligence confirmed what detectives had begun to fear. He had fled overseas, making his way to Amsterdam. His escape threatened to delay justice, but police refused to let him disappear into the cracks of another city. Working with Dutch authorities, they tracked him down, and on December 4, 2023, Khan was arrested in the Netherlands. Just over a month later, he was extradited to the UK, flown back under escort to face trial. With all 4 men now in custody, the Metropolitan Police could begin preparing for the trial that would lay bare the details of the killing. The Crown Prosecution Service was confident. The evidence was layered and compelling. Forensic proof from the Mitsubishi, witness accounts, CCTV footage, mobile data, and the chilling testimony of the taxi driver who had watched the ambush unfold in front of him. What began to emerge was not simply a spontaneous outburst of violence, but a carefully coordinated execution, with each suspect assigned a role. Khan and Mia had delivered the violence. Naim had driven the stolen car, and Ali had not only assisted in the attack but robbed the dying man of his phone. The months leading up to the trial were agonizing for the Senage family. They attended hearings, each appearance of the suspects in court a reminder of the faces behind their loss. The victim's cousin, Elira, became the family's voice, determined to see justice served. Her words were raw and filled with anguish, describing the pain of losing a loved one in such a savage way. To her and the rest of the family, the men in the dock were not simply criminals. They were cowards who had acted together to destroy one man's life, leaving devastation behind. By the time the trial began at the Old Bailey, the media had latched onto the case. Knife crime had become a national crisis, dominating headlines with stories of teenagers and young men slaughtered in public places. The murder of Anselm Senage was another grim chapter in that story, but it stood out because of the brazen nature of the attack. To stop a taxi in a residential street, to surround it with weapons, and to kill a man in seconds before fleeing into the night. It struck fear into the public and served as a reminder that London streets were vulnerable to sudden eruptions of violence. Inside the courtroom, the trial unfolded like a reconstruction of that November night. Jurors were shown CCTV clips of the Mitsubishi circling the area, positioning itself behind the taxi. They listened to the account of the driver, who described how his passenger had expressed terror just moments before the ambush. Forensic experts testified about blood traces and DNA found on clothing and in the stolen car. Phone analysts presented records that mapped the suspect's movements with chilling accuracy. The prosecution argued that this was no random act, but a targeted killing, executed with planning and precision. For the defense teams, the strategy was to create doubt. Lawyers attempted to portray the attack as chaotic, suggesting that the roles of the suspects were unclear. Perhaps it was not Khan who had delivered the fatal stab. Perhaps the others had not known what would unfold that night. But the weight of evidence pressed heavily against them. Every piece of the puzzle, CCTV, DNA, phones, eyewitness testimony, pointed back to the 4 young men who had stalked and killed Anselm Senage. Throughout the trial, the atmosphere was tense. Family members sat in the public gallery, often in tears as graphic details were recounted. The taxi driver, visibly shaken, relived the terror of that night, his voice quivering as he described the helplessness of sitting behind the wheel as masked men attacked his passenger. Jurors, too, appeared visibly unsettled at times, faced with the stark brutality of the crime. As the trial neared its conclusion in early 2025, the evidence had left little room for ambiguity. The jury was tasked with deciding on murder charges for Khan and Mia, and manslaughter for Ali and Naeem. Their deliberations were lengthy, but the verdicts, when delivered in January, were decisive. Khan and Mia were found guilty of murder and possession of weapons. Ali and Naeem, though not directly delivering the fatal blow, were convicted of manslaughter for their roles in enabling and supporting the attack. For the family of the victim, the verdicts were a moment of justice, but they did little to soothe the raw wound of loss. Alira Senage described the men as heartless, her voice cracking as she spoke of the emptiness left behind. She condemned them as cowards who needed weapons and numbers to overpower one man. The judge, Judy Concasi, echoed those sentiments, describing the attack as callous and shocking, a killing carried out in public with complete disregard for human life. As the trial came to an end, the focus shifted to sentencing. The courtroom would soon hear how long each of the 4 men would spend behind bars, a moment that would mark the formal end of a case that had gripped London for more than a year. For detectives like Sergeant Brett Hagan, who had led the investigation from the start, it was a chance to reflect on the tireless work that had brought the killers to justice. For the Senage family, it was another painful reminder of what had been taken from them, and of the final words their loved one had spoken in a taxi on that cold November night. When the trial ended with guilty verdicts, the families of both the victim and the perpetrators braced themselves for the final stage: sentencing. It was April 2025 when the 4 young men were brought back to the Old Bailey to learn their fates. The courtroom was tense, filled with the hum of whispered conversations, reporters scribbling notes, and the heavy anticipation of justice about to be measured out. In the dock, the faces of Khan, Mia, Ali, and Naeem reflected varying shades of defiance, fear, and resignation. Across from them, the Senage family sat in quiet anguish, waiting for the judge to speak the words that would bring some form of closure, though not healing. Judge Judy Concasi delivered a statement that cut through the silence with the authority of someone who had spent weeks immersed in the cruelty of the case. She described the killing as callous and shocking, emphasizing its premeditated nature and the brazen disregard for human life. She spoke of the public nature of the attack, how the group had stopped a taxi on a London street, armed with long knives and machetes, and executed their plan in seconds without hesitation. The judge's words painted a portrait of arrogance and brutality, violence committed with full knowledge of the fear it would spread. The sentences followed. Mohammed Saqib Khan, the man who had plunged the knife into Anselm Senage's chest, was given life imprisonment with a minimum term of 26 years. Beside him, the younger Muhammad Samuel Mia received the same punishment, life with a minimum of 25 years. Zain Ali, convicted of manslaughter for his role in the attack and the theft of Senej's phone, was sentenced to 14 years in prison. Finally, Ibrahim Naim, the teenager who had driven the stolen Mitsubishi and enabled the killers to strike and escape, received 10 years and 6 months. Each sentence reflected not only the roles they had played that night, but the judge's assessment of their culpability and danger to society. For the family, listening to the sentences was a moment heavy with conflicting emotions. Relief that justice had been served sat side by side with grief that no amount of prison time could bring Anselm back. His cousin, Elira, spoke powerfully in court, describing the killers as cowards who had relied on numbers and weapons to destroy one man's life. She expressed the family's pain, the void left behind, and the torment of imagining Anselm's final moments in that taxi. Her words carried a raw honesty that left the courtroom silent. Detectives and prosecutors echoed the family's sense of relief. Sergeant Brett Hagen, who had led the investigation from the earliest hours, reflected on the scale of the work required to bring the 4 men to justice. From scouring CCTV footage to coordinating an international arrest in Amsterdam, the investigation had demanded relentless effort. To see it end in convictions and lengthy sentences was, for the police, a demonstration that determination and meticulous work could cut through the fear created by such crimes. Hagen spoke of solidarity with the Senej family, acknowledging that justice could not heal their loss, but could at least provide accountability. Yet beyond the walls of the courtroom, the case stirred broader questions about London's struggle with knife crime. The murder of Anselm Senej had not been a random act, nor the result of a sudden argument. It had been planned, coordinated, and executed with chilling efficiency. It highlighted the ways in which young men, some barely into adulthood, became entangled in networks of violence that left destruction in their wake. Community leaders spoke of the case as another wake-up call, a reminder that behind each statistic lay a family torn apart, a future erased, and a cycle of fear that rippled through entire neighborhoods. For those who lived near the junction of Victoria Avenue and Grangewood Street, the memory of that night remained vivid. Residents described hearing shouting, the sound of glass, and then the distant wail of sirens. In the days that followed, flowers and candles appeared on the pavement, a small shrine to a young man whose life had ended in their midst. Even after the police tape came down and the streets returned to normal, the sense of vulnerability lingered. To know that a man could be killed so quickly and with such precision in a place they considered home was unsettling. As months passed, the story of Anselm Senej became one thread in the larger narrative of knife crime in the capital. Politicians cited the case as evidence of the urgent need for stronger measures, while charities working with young people pointed to it as an example of what happens when opportunities are limited and rivalries escalate unchecked. For those who knew Anselm personally, however, the headlines and debates mattered less than the daily absence of his presence. His friends remembered his energy and his ambition, even as they acknowledged the risks he had taken. His family clung to memories, photographs, and the hope that, by speaking out, they could prevent another family from experiencing the same devastation. The killers, meanwhile, faced futures defined by prison walls. Khan and Mia, both still relatively young, would spend the prime of their lives incarcerated, their choices on that November night binding them to decades behind bars. Ali and Naim, though sentenced to shorter terms, faced years of reflection on their roles in a crime that had destroyed lives. Their convictions stood as warnings, yet also as grim evidence of how deeply entrenched violence had become in some corners of London's youth culture. The case left behind stark images that refused to fade. A taxi blocked in on a quiet street, masked figures emerging with weapons, a young man uttering words of dread that proved true. It was these details that made the story resonate, not only in the courtroom but in living rooms across the country. They were reminders that knife crime was not an abstract issue but a human tragedy, each incident carrying with it a ripple of grief and fear. In the end, the murder of Anselm Senej was more than a headline or a statistic. It was the story of a young man who sensed the danger pursuing him, who spoke his fear aloud moments before it became reality. It was the story of four young men who chose violence, believing they could act with impunity, only to find themselves hunted down and held accountable. And it was the story of a family whose grief will never fade, who spoke out not only to condemn the killers but to remind the world that behind every case like this lies a brother, a cousin, a son, a life with promise that can never be restored. For Newham, the events of that November night remain etched into memory. For London, they serve as another reminder of the fragility of safety and the devastating cost of unchecked violence. And for the family of Anselm Senage, the story will forever be personal. A wound carved into their lives, carried with them long after the sentences have been served and the headlines have moved on.